At the most exclusive charity gala of the year, Stephen Harrison raised his champagne glass and laughed. "You want to know my biggest mistake?" he announced to the circle of CEOs and investors. "Marrying her." He pointed at his black wife, Natalie, standing just 10 feet away. The crowd chuckled. Crystal glasses clinked. Natalie stood motionless, her expression unreadable. "But don't worry," Stephen continued. "I'm filing for divorce first thing Monday. Consider this my public announcement." Then the ballroom doors swung open. A man walked in, and within minutes, everything satisfying about that moment came crashing down. 3 hours before Stephen Harrison destroyed his own life, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror adjusting his tie. The presidential suite at the Meridian Hotel cost $4,000 a night. Money he could not afford but charged to his company anyway. Appearances mattered. They were everything. Behind him, Natalie emerged from the bedroom in an emerald green gown that caught the light with every movement. She had chosen it carefully, elegant but understated. Her dark skin glowed against the fabric, and her natural hair was styled in an updo that had taken hours to perfect. Stephen glanced at her reflection and frowned. "You're wearing that?" Natalie met his eyes in the mirror. "You said green was appropriate for a charity gala?" "I said dark green. That's practically neon." He turned around, looking her up and down with the expression of a man inspecting a purchase he regretted. "And your hair? Could you not have straightened it? These people expect a certain standard." These people. Natalie had heard that phrase countless times over the past 5 years. It meant wealthy people, white people, people who belonged to a world Stephen desperately wanted to claim as his own. She said nothing. After 5 years of marriage, she had learned that silence was easier than argument. Arguments led to accusations, to Stephen reminding her how lucky she was, how grateful she should be. She had stopped believing that years ago, but she stayed anyway, partly out of stubbornness, partly because leaving meant admitting she had made a terrible mistake. "Tonight is important," Stephen continued, checking his Rolex, a gift he had bought himself and told everyone was from a grateful client. "There's a major investment group looking for real estate partnerships. If I can get in front of the right people, this could change everything." What he did not say, what Natalie had discovered 3 months ago by accidentally seeing documents on his laptop, was that Harrison Real Estate was $47 million in debt. The company was hemorrhaging money. Stephen needed this deal not to grow his business, but to save it from complete collapse. She had not confronted him about it. What would be the point? He would deny it, or blame her somehow, or turn it into another lecture about how she did not understand his world. "Just stay close to me," Stephen said, straightening his cuffs. "Let me do the talking. When people ask what you do, keep it simple. These people do not want to hear your whole life story." Natalie almost laughed. Her whole life story. Stephen did not even know her whole life story. He had never asked. In 5 years, he had never once asked about her family beyond confirming that her mother was dead and her father was out of the picture. That had been enough for him. An orphan with no connections, no complications. Someone who needed him. The truth was far more complicated. Natalie was born Natalie Thompson, daughter of Carlos Thompson, founder of Thompson Global Investments, one of the largest private equity firms in the country. She had grown up in a mansion with 17 rooms and a staff of 12. She had attended the finest schools, traveled to 30 countries before she turned 18, and received a trust fund worth more than Stephen's entire company. But 10 years ago, she had walked away from all of it. The falling out with her father had been devastating. Carlos had opposed her mother's choices, had been absent during her illness, had prioritized business over family until it was too late. When her mother died alone in a hospital room while Carlos was closing a deal in Singapore, something broke inside Natalie that could not be repaired. She had taken her mother's maiden name, becoming Natalie Carter, refused the trust fund, and built her own career as an architect. Everything she had accomplished since then, she had earned herself. The Pacific Tower downtown, the Riverside Cultural Center, the Morrison Bridge renovation. Her work, her talent, her name on the blueprints, even if that name was one she had chosen to honor her mother's memory. When she met Stephen at a gallery opening 6 years ago, she was Natalie Carter, independent architect. He was charming, ambitious, attentive. He saw a beautiful black woman with no apparent family money and pursued her with intensity. She had wanted to believe he loved her for who she was. After they married, she became Natalie Harrison. It took 3 years of that marriage to realize he had married her because she made him feel superior. What Natalie did not know, what she would only learn tonight, was that her father had never truly let her go. Carlos Thompson had quietly tracked his daughter's career from a distance, and through a web of subsidiary companies and anonymous investments, he had become the silent backer of several buildings she designed. He never interfered, never took credit, never reached out. He simply made sure that her talent had the opportunity to shine. It was his way of protecting her without controlling her, of being present without being seen. The limousine ride to the gala was silent. Stephen scrolled through his phone, reviewing names and photos of attendees, memorizing details that might help him ingratiate himself to the right people. Natalie looked out the window at the city lights and thought about the phone call she had received that afternoon. Her father's voice, after 10 years, still carried the same weight. "I know about the gala tonight. I know about Stephen. And I know you've been to see a divorce lawyer." Natalie had not asked how he knew. Carlos Thompson had resources that most people could not imagine. He probably knew what Stephen had for breakfast. "If you need me," Carlos had said, "I will be there." She had not responded. She was still deciding whether she wanted him there, whether she was ready to face him after a decade of silence. But she had not said no. The Meridian Ballroom was everything Stephen had dreamed of. Crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across marble floors. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms carrying silver trays of champagne and canapes. And everywhere the people who mattered. CEOs, hedge fund managers, tech billionaires, old money heirs trying to look humble and new money moguls trying to look established. Stephen transformed the moment they entered. His posture straightened, his smile widened, his voice took on a practiced warmth. He guided Natalie through the room with his hand on the small of her back, steering her like a prop. "Stephen Harrison!" A portly man in an expensive suit approached them with an outstretched hand. "Good to see you, and this must be the famous wife. Charles, great to see you." Stephen shook his hand vigorously. "Yes, this is my wife. Darling, this is Charles Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Logistics." Not her name, never her name, just my wife, as if she were an accessory rather than a person. Charles Whitmore looked at Natalie with the particular gaze that wealthy white men often reserved for black women at events like these, a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. "Lovely to meet you. What do you do?" Before Natalie could answer, Stephen jumped in. "She handles things at home. You know how it is. Someone has to manage the domestic side while we're out conquering the world." Natalie felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the wall she had built around her patience. "Actually," she said, her voice calm but clear, "I'm an architect. I designed the Pacific Tower downtown." Silence. Charles Whitmore's eyebrows rose. Stephen's smile froze on his face. "The Pacific Tower?" Charles said. "That's a remarkable building. I had a meeting there last month. The atrium is stunning." "Thank you." Natalie allowed herself a small smile. "It took 3 years to complete." Stephen laughed, a forced sound that did not reach his eyes. "She's being modest. It was a team effort, obviously. Anyway, Charles, I wanted to talk to you about some opportunities in the logistics sector." He pulled Natalie away before the conversation could continue, his grip on her arm tighter than necessary. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "I told you to let me talk." He asked me a direct question. And I answered it for you. Stephen's jaw was tight. Do not embarrass me tonight, Natalie. I mean it. Everything I have worked for is riding on this. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the desperation beneath the expensive suit and practiced smile. He was terrified. His whole empire was built on sand, and he could feel it shifting beneath his feet. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Then she remembered every insult, every dismissal, every time he had made her feel small so he could feel big. The next 2 hours were a performance. Stephen worked the room like a politician, laughing at jokes that were not funny, agreeing with opinions he did not hold, dropping hints about deals and connections that were mostly fabricated. Natalie drifted beside him, increasingly invisible, watching the elaborate theater of wealth and status. She noticed a man watching Stephen with particular interest. Tall, distinguished, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars, but carrying himself with the ease of someone who had stopped thinking about money long ago. He introduced himself as Jonathan Pierce when Stephen eagerly approached him. I represent a private investment group looking for real estate opportunities, Jonathan said smoothly. We have been observing your company with interest, Mr. Harrison. Stephen nearly vibrated with excitement. This was it. The opportunity he had been waiting for. What he did not notice was the way Jonathan's eyes flickered briefly to Natalie, a look of recognition that vanished as quickly as it appeared. What he did not know was that Jonathan Pierce was not just any investor. He was Carlos Thompson's right hand, sent to observe and report. As the evening wore on, Stephen drank more than he should have. The champagne loosened his tongue, and the stress of maintaining his facade began to crack. He found himself surrounded by a group of businessmen, their laughter encouraging him, their attention intoxicating. That was when he made the announcement that would end everything. The laughter that followed Stephen's announcement rippled through the circle of businessmen like a wave. Some laughed because they found it genuinely amusing. Others laughed because Stephen was laughing, and in rooms like this, people mirrored power even when power was an illusion. Natalie stood 10 feet away, close enough to hear every word, close enough to see the smirk on her husband's face as he delivered what he clearly thought was a devastating blow. She felt the eyes of the room turning toward her, waiting for tears, for a scene, for the kind of emotional collapse that would give them something to discuss over brunch for weeks to come. She gave them nothing. Instead, she looked directly at Stephen, her expression composed, almost serene. When she spoke, her voice carried just far enough for the surrounding guests to hear. Stephen, you just said your biggest mistake, but you're wrong. She let the words settle. Your biggest mistake is underestimating me, and you're about to understand why. Stephen's smirk faltered. He had expected humiliation, perhaps begging, maybe a dramatic exit. This quiet confidence unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. He recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. What are you going to do? Call your mother back from the grave? The cruelty of the words hung in the air. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Even among the callous elite, there were lines. Natalie did not flinch. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, and she glanced at the screen. For the first time that evening, a small smile crossed her lips. She slipped the phone back without answering and simply stood there, watching her husband with an expression he had never seen before. It looked almost like pity. The minutes that followed were torture for Natalie, though she refused to show it. The crowd did what crowds always do when someone falls from grace. They retreated. Conversations that had been open to her before now turned inward, backs forming walls, voices dropping to whispers whenever she approached. She heard fragments as she moved through the room. Poor thing, she must be devastated. I always thought there was something off about that marriage. Well, what did she expect? They're from completely different worlds. Different worlds. The phrase almost made her laugh. If only they knew. She took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, someone she recognized from her visits to the Meridian over the years. He gave her an almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. The staff always knew more than the guests realized. They had seen Stephen's behavior toward Natalie at previous events, the dismissive comments, the controlling gestures. They had also seen Natalie treat them with respect, learn their names, ask about their families. Small kindnesses mattered. Tonight, they felt like the only kindness in the room. Jonathan Pierce was watching her from across the ballroom. She caught his eye and saw something that might have been reassurance. He was waiting, she realized, waiting for something or someone. Stephen, meanwhile, was trying to capitalize on the attention. He had moved from the circle of businessmen to a group of investors, his voice loud with false confidence. "Sometimes you have to make hard decisions in life," he was saying. "Cut your losses before they drag you down. That's what separates successful men from failures." He did not notice how some of the investors exchanged glances. He did not see the way Jonathan Pierce moved quietly toward the ballroom entrance. He was too busy performing, too intoxicated by champagne and his own ego to recognize that the ground beneath him was already crumbling. At precisely 9:37, the ballroom doors opened. The man who entered was in his early 60s, tall and powerfully built despite his age. His suit was simple by the standards of the room, a dark navy with no visible logos or ostentatious details. But those who understood money, real money, recognized the cut and fabric instantly. This was a suit that cost more than most cars, worn by a man who had stopped thinking about price tags decades ago. Carlos Thompson moved through the room like a ship through water, creating ripples without apparent effort. The host of the gala nearly tripped over himself rushing to greet him. Guests who had been deep in conversation suddenly found reasons to drift closer. The energy of the entire room shifted toward this new center of gravity. Stephen noticed the commotion and turned. When he recognized the face, his eyes went wide. "Oh my God," he breathed. "That's Carlos Thompson." Carlos Thompson, the name that appeared on Forbes lists and business school case studies. The founder of Thompson Global Investments, a private equity empire worth more than $30 billion. The man who had started with nothing and built a fortune through a combination of brilliance, ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural ability to see opportunities others missed. Stephen straightened his jacket and ran a hand through his hair. This was it. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. If he could just get 5 minutes with Carlos Thompson, if he could just make an impression, everything could change. He pushed through the crowd, positioning himself in Carlos's path. "Mr. Thompson!" Stephen extended his hand with his most confident smile. "Stephen Harrison, CEO of Harrison Real Estate. It's an incredible honor to meet you. I've followed your career for years, and I have to say, your approach to value investing has completely transformed how I think about—" Carlos looked at Stephen, the way one might look at a fly that had landed on one's dinner. A brief acknowledgement that the fly existed, followed by complete dismissal. He stepped around Stephen without a word and continued walking. Stephen stood frozen, his hand still extended, his smile calcifying into something rigid and confused. Carlos had seen someone across the room. His stride, which had been measured and controlled, quickened almost imperceptibly. The crowd parted before him, sensing that something significant was happening even if they did not understand what. He stopped in front of Natalie. The ballroom fell silent. Every eye in the room fixed on this strange tableau, the legendary billionaire standing before the woman who had just been publicly humiliated. When Carlos spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly in the hush. "Natalie." Natalie looked at her father for the first time in 10 years. The last time she had seen him, she had been screaming at him in a hospital hallway, blaming him for her mother's lonely death, swearing she would never speak to him again. He had aged since then. There was gray at his temples now, lines around his eyes that had not been there before. But his gaze was the same, direct, penetrating, and right now, filled with something that looked remarkably like pride. "Father." Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened. Carlos opened his arms and Natalie stepped into them. The embrace lasted only a moment. But it contained 10 years of silence, of regret, of words unspoken. When they separated, Carlos turned to face the watching crowd. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of a man accustomed to addressing boardrooms and shareholders. "Allow me to introduce my daughter, Natalie Thompson, one of the most talented architects of her generation, though she has been too modest to tell any of you that." The silence that followed was absolute. Stephen Harrison looked like a man watching his own funeral. His face had gone pale and his mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Jonathan Pierce appeared at Carlos's side. "Sir, I've compiled the information you requested." Carlos nodded. "The man who just called my daughter a social mistake. That would be the gentleman standing over there looking like he's about to be ill." Jonathan confirmed this with a slight inclination of his head. "Stephen Harrison, CEO of Harrison Real Estate, currently $47 million in debt. His company has received financing through 3 different shell corporations over the past 3 years, all of which trace back to Thompson Global subsidiaries." The color drained further from Stephen's face. He stumbled forward, his voice cracking. "Mr. Thompson, I had no idea. This is all a misunderstanding. Natalie never told me who her father was. If I had known..." "If you had known..." Carlos's voice was dangerously soft. "If you had known, you would have treated her differently. You would have shown her respect. You would have refrained from mocking her in public, from calling her a mistake, from behaving like a man who sees his wife as property rather than a person." Stephen struggled for words. "I love Natalie. I was just... the stress of business. I had too much to drink." "Love." Carlos repeated the word as if examining a counterfeit bill. "I have been watching you for 3 years, Mr. Harrison. I wanted to see what kind of man my daughter had married. I wanted to give you a chance to prove yourself worthy of her." His voice hardened. "You failed." The crowd had begun to shift. People who had been laughing with Stephen minutes ago now found pressing reasons to be elsewhere. Business partners who had clapped him on the back were suddenly very interested in their phones. The tide had turned, and everyone could feel it. Stephen made one last desperate attempt. "You can't blame me for not knowing. Natalie lied to me. She hid who she was for 5 years. He turned to the crowd, seeking allies. "She's the one who deceived me. I'm the victim here." A few heads nodded uncertainly. It was a reasonable point. Why had Natalie hidden her identity? What kind of marriage was built on such a fundamental deception? The whispers began again, this time with a different tenor. Natalie watched the room recalibrate, watched doubt creep across faces that had been sympathetic moments before. Carlos started to speak, ready to defend his daughter, but Natalie raised her hand. This was her moment. She had been silent for 5 years. She would not be silent now. "You're right, Stephen." Her voice was clear and strong. "I did hide my identity. I wanted to be loved for who I am, not for my father's money. I wanted to find someone who saw me, not my inheritance." She stepped forward, and the crowd unconsciously leaned in. "But let me ask you something. In 5 years of marriage, did you ever ask about my family? Did you ever wonder why I had no relatives at our wedding? Did you ever ask about my childhood, my parents, my history?" She shook her head slowly. "You didn't, because you didn't care. You saw a beautiful woman with no connections, no complications, no one to challenge your authority. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a trophy." Stephen opened his mouth to protest, but Natalie continued. "I didn't hide anything, Stephen. You simply never asked. You never looked past what you wanted to see. That's not deception. That's your own blindness." The whispers stopped. The room was completely still. I have spent 5 years making myself small so you could feel big, Natalie said. I have endured your insults, your control, your contempt. And tonight, when you stood in front of these people and called me your biggest mistake, I realized something. She looked directly into his eyes. The only mistake was believing that love meant accepting cruelty. Stephen had no response. For the first time in his adult life, he had nothing to say. Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat. Mr. Thompson, shall I proceed with the notifications? Carlos looked at his daughter. That depends on Natalie. Every eye in the room turned to her. The power that Stephen had craved all his life, the attention of the elite, the center of the social universe, all of it now focused on the woman he had dismissed as worthless. Natalie felt the weight of the moment. She could destroy Stephen completely with a word. Her father's resources were virtually unlimited. He could bankrupt Stephen's company, blacklist him from every board and partnership in the country, erase his professional existence with a few phone calls. Part of her wanted that. The wounded part, the part that remembered every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every time he had made her feel like less than she was. But that was not who she wanted to be. Natalie stepped away from the crowd, moving toward a quiet corner near the tall windows overlooking the city. Carlos followed her, leaving Jonathan to keep watch over the room where Stephen stood paralyzed among guests who suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. Father and daughter stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the lights of the downtown skyline. I can end him tonight, Carlos said quietly. One phone call. His company, his reputation, his future. All of it gone by morning. Natalie watched a plane blink its way across the darkness. 10 years ago, she would have given anything to hear her father offer to fight for her. 10 years ago, when her mother was dying and he was an ocean away, when she had needed him and he had chosen business instead. But she was not the same person she had been 10 years ago. Why did you come tonight? She asked. Carlos was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its boardroom authority. He sounded like what he was, a father who had failed and knew it. Because I wasn't there when your mother needed me. I wasn't there when you needed me. And I have spent every day since then trying to find a way to make that right. He turned to face her. I know I can't fix the past, but when you called this afternoon, I thought maybe I could be here for the present. Natalie felt something shift inside her, a wall she had built brick by brick over 10 years beginning to crack. She had held on to her anger for so long that she had forgotten what lay beneath it. Grief. Loss. And underneath all of that, love that had never quite died. I didn't call to ask you to destroy him, she said. I know. I called because I needed to know I wasn't alone. She finally looked at her father. I've been alone for a long time. I thought that was strength. I thought cutting everyone off, proving I could survive without help, that meant I was strong. Carlos shook his head. Strength isn't isolation. I learned that too late. I built an empire and lost my family. That's not strength. That's just a different kind of failure. Through the window's reflection, Natalie could see the ballroom behind them. Stephen was still standing where she had left him, surrounded by empty space as guests maintained a careful distance. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, as if the exposure of his cruelty had physically reduced him. I want to handle this myself, Natalie said. Not because I need to prove anything, but because this is my life, my marriage, my decision. I've let other people define my worth for too long. First I ran from your shadow. Then I shrank myself to fit Stephen's ego. I'm done living in reaction to other people. Carlos nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Just stand there. Natalie's voice softened. Just be my father. Not Carlos Thompson, the billionaire. Just my dad, watching his daughter take control of her own life. For a moment, Carlos Thompson, a man who had negotiated with world leaders and commanded rooms full of the most powerful people on Earth, looked like he might cry. He simply nodded once, and Natalie understood that this was enough. She walked back toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted for her now, not out of dismissal, but out of something approaching respect. She had faced public humiliation and emerged with her dignity intact. In a room full of people who spent their lives cultivating images, that kind of authenticity was rare and slightly terrifying. Natalie stopped a few feet from Stephen. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, something between fear and the first glimmer of genuine recognition. "Natalie," he started, his voice hoarse, She held up her hand, and he fell silent. "I'm going to speak now," she said, "and you're going to listen. It's the least you can do after 5 years of not letting me finish a sentence." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Stephen's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. "My name is Natalie Thompson. I was born with that name, and I am taking it back." She let those words settle. 10 years ago, I changed it because I wanted to build my own life, my own career, my own identity apart from my father's shadow. I became Natalie Carter, then Natalie Harrison when I married you. But tonight, I'm reclaiming who I've always been. She looked around the room at the watching faces, the people who had laughed at her, ignored her, whispered about her. "Tonight, my husband announced he was filing for divorce as if I were a bad investment he was liquidating." Her voice remained steady. "What he doesn't know is that I've already filed. 2 weeks ago. The papers are with my lawyer, waiting for his signature." Stephen's face went white. "You filed? Before tonight? You knew this whole time and said nothing?" "I said nothing because there was nothing left to say." Natalie's gaze was unwavering. "I've known about your company's debt for 3 months. I've known about your failing projects, your desperate deals. I stayed silent because I wanted to be sure. Because I wanted to leave not in anger, but in clarity." She reached down and slowly removed her wedding ring. The diamond caught the chandelier light one last time before she placed it on the nearest table with a soft click. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Stephen. Not the apartment, not the cars, not a cent of whatever you have left after the creditors are finished. I don't need it. I never needed it." She straightened, standing at her full height. "I'm keeping only what I earned myself, my work, my reputation, my self-respect." She looked at Stephen one final time. "I hope someday you learn that a person's worth isn't measured by their bank account or their last name. But honestly, that's not my problem anymore." She turned and walked toward her father, who stood watching with quiet pride. Jonathan Pierce gave her a small nod of respect as she passed. Behind her, Stephen Harrison stood alone in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by people who suddenly had urgent reasons to be elsewhere. The host was already making apologetic gestures. Business cards that had been offered were being quietly retrieved. The empire of illusions Stephen had spent years constructing collapsed in real time. At the ballroom doors, Natalie stopped and looked back, not at Stephen, but at the room itself, the crystal chandeliers, the marble floors, the glittering assembly of wealth and power. She had spent 5 years trying to belong here, to earn acceptance from people who would never see her as anything but an outsider. She did not need their acceptance anymore. Natalie and Carlos walked out of the Meridian Hotel together, into a cool night that smelled of rain and possibility. The city spread out before them, full of buildings and a future she would build on her own terms. 6 months later, Natalie stood in the office of her new architecture firm. The space was modest compared to her father's empire, just 3 rooms in a converted warehouse downtown, but every detail reflected her vision. Her name was on the door. Thompson Design Studio. Her designs covered the walls. Her team, small but talented, believed in what they were building together. The reconciliation with Carlos was ongoing. They had dinner once a week, sometimes more. The conversations were often difficult, full of old wounds and careful honesty. but they were talking. After 10 years of silence, that felt like a miracle. She had heard about Stephen through mutual acquaintances. His company had declared bankruptcy within 3 months of the gala. The details of his behavior that night had spread through the business community with remarkable speed, and no one wanted to be associated with the man who had publicly humiliated Carlos Thompson's daughter. He had moved to another city. Some said to start over. Others said to hide. Natalie did not feel satisfaction at his downfall. She did not feel vindication. Mostly, she felt free. On her desk sat a framed photograph that had not been there a month ago. It showed a younger Carlos and a woman with Natalie's eyes, holding a baby between them. Her mother had kept this photo on her nightstand until the day she died. Carlos had given it to Natalie at their last dinner, his hands trembling slightly as he passed it across the table. "She would be proud of you," he had said. "I'm proud of you." Natalie touched the frame now, feeling the weight of everything that photo represented. Loss and love. Endings and beginnings. The complicated truth that family could wound you deeply and still be worth fighting for. Outside her window, the city skyline rose against the afternoon light. There would be more buildings to design, more challenges to face, more chances to create something meaningful. She was Natalie Thompson, architect, daughter, survivor. She had walked through fire and emerged with her dignity intact, and she was just getting started.